Hey everyone, welcome to Opinionsplosion. It's much less exciting than the name implies. So then, what is Opinionsplosion? Well, it occurred to me recently that while I do express a lot of opinions in my various videos, the format doesn't really allow me to properly express where I'm coming from on said opinions. Mostly I'm going for reactions, and when you're going purely for reactions, there isn't really room for nuanced discussion. So what was my solution? A series dedicated to ranting at length about franchises and their various entries, now known as Opinionsplosion, because why the fuck not? It's also really easy content for me to put out while I'm preoccupied with college, so since I wasn't able to put out a Halloween video this year, let's make up for it by talking about Silent Hill a whole bunch. Oh, and it probably goes without saying, but just in case, spoilers ahoy. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, he's just gonna dump all over the Western Silent Hill games for the whole duration. Well, you're not entirely right. I'm sure there will be some jabs at those games because it's honestly kinda hard for me to resist, but it's not gonna be the focus here. The focus of this little one-sided conversation is on the Golden Trilogy, the three games that, in many people's opinions, including my own, the series could have begun and ended with. Before I start on those, however, I am going to make a tiny detour on that statement. In my Silent Hill abridged stuff, which there probably won't be any more of, sorry, the only one of those other games I've really made any significant cracks at is Shattered Memories. And I think that gave a lot of people the impression that I hate Shattered Memories. That is actually not the case. Well, not completely. Honestly, if I were to rank them all, Shattered Memories would probably be neck and neck with Silent Hill 4, just under the original 3. I think it was a super ambitious game with some really great ideas at work, and did a decent job at communicating its themes with some amount of subtlety. That being said, the decision to base it around the framework of Silent Hill 1, when it really could have stood on its own, pissed me off. A part of that is because I've seen comments all over the place claiming that Shattered Memories renders 1 and 3 non-canon, or that 1 doesn't matter anymore because they made one where they had a better idea what a Silent Hill game ought to be, and I realize those are idiotic fallacies, and putting as much stock in them as I have is entirely my own hang-up. But, you know, I'm stubborn, so I don't see it going away anytime soon. I've gotten into really stupid arguments on this point that almost made me forget how much I actually did like a lot of what else the game had to offer. I am, after all, incredibly thin-skinned by anyone's account. But it makes it all the more frustrating, knowing that the game could have done just as well with its own characters, especially considering that, apart from names and occupations, these characters had almost no connections to their Silent Hill 1 counterparts. It sounds crazy to say it out loud, but if they'd called, like, Harry, Henry, or Dahlia, Delilah, or whatever, that alone would have improved my opinion on it at least tenfold. There's other things that still might have bugged me, like lack of enemy variety and some overly simplistic puzzles, but all in all, I think that alone would have sold me more on the story. Shattered Memories is a weird one for me to think about. I like it a lot more than, say, Origins, Homecoming, Downpour, or Book of Memories, but it simultaneously angers me way more than any of those games for that one stupid, trivial, nitpicky reason. Well, I've already spent way too much time deliberating on the negatives here, so let's dive into the meat of this matter. The disgusting, weeks-old meat hanging from rusted hooks in a grated locker caked in blood. When I'm asked which Silent Hill game is my favorite, it's honestly a tough call for me. It sort of rotates between the first three, and I think the reason for that is I feel like each of them does one important thing better than the others. That's not, of course, to say that the other two are especially lacking in the area where the other one shines, but they definitely each have their own distinct strength. And yeah, in some cases they are kinda lacking. So obviously, going into these, I'm going to be talking about the first one first. But I feel I should clarify, Silent Hill 1 was not my introduction to Silent Hill. Basically, I watched some friends play 3 and 4 at one of their houses the night of our high school graduation, because what better way to celebrate stepping out into the real world than with horrible, overwhelming darkness? Needless to say, I was immediately entranced by their atmosphere and monster designs, and eventually I picked up 2, 3, and 4 on the PS2 for myself. I didn't bother with 1 because I couldn't really find it anywhere, and I figured that it probably hadn't aged that well anyway. Well, eventually, it came out on PSN, and my curiosity got the best of me, so I downloaded it, not expecting a whole lot, and I'm so glad I didn't, because I got such a pleasant fucking surprise out of it. By pleasant, of course, I mean horrifying. Because to me, SH1 had the strongest horror factor in the franchise. Now, I'm sure when I say that, you're probably thinking a lot of the same things I was before I played it, and wondering what the hell's wrong with me. Honestly, it's so hard for me to explain because I'm not an expert on what makes horror work, and obviously, different things scare different people. I think there's one moment that really nailed it home for me, what SH1 was doing, though. So I had gone through Midwich Elementary School and Alchemilla Hospital, and I didn't quite realize it at the time, but from there I decided to continue playing the game while I was in a Skype call because I didn't want to be alone while playing it. So the next place I went during this call was an antique shop, and anyone who's played the game before knows this is a small, simple area that serves as a segue into the other world after a cutscene. This was my first time playing it, and I went into this tiny, dark, quiet area not knowing that. Then I heard scraping and knocking, and I immediately froze. As soon as I was able to stop being a gigantic coward, I looked around as cautiously as possible, chills running down my spine. Then I found out the reason I was hearing those sounds is that one of my friend's pets was fucking around while the call was going on, just like clawing at the door and knocking shit over. That's when I basically realized that this game was fucking terrifying for me. And it didn't even have so much to do with the monsters that I had seen up until then, but just that atmosphere alone. It made me more worried about what was coming up than anything that I had actually seen. It was weird to think about, because it was so simple compared to 2 and 3, but maybe that's what made it work. It was dark, lonely, rough, oppressive, and difficult to control at times, and it was all done in such a way that somehow culminated in what I still consider to this day to be one of the actual scariest horror games I've ever played. Side note, number 1 spot goes to the first Fatal Frame, which I haven't completed, and has scared me away from the rest of the series, because when it comes to ghosts, I just cannot fucking deal. Silent Hill monsters still have to deal somewhat with the laws of physics. Ghosts, not so much. But yeah, hell, even after abridging SH1 and turning it into a gyromancy-centric yuck-fest, which I got way too much mileage out of that, considering she literally said gyromancy once in the entire game, I still get those chills whenever I actually play it, and no amount of convincing myself, oh, the worst thing around the corner will be a skinless dog or knife-wielding murder baby, ever seems to erase it. Now, Silent Hill 1's story was serviceable for what it needed to do. Establish a reason for the spooks and its protagonist's motivation. But I think if you ask any Silent Hill fan which game had the absolute best story out of any of them, most of them, including myself, will give you the same answer: Silent Hill 2. And I know what you're thinking. If it's so good, why don't you want to abridge it like you did 1 and 3? I mean, you thought that if you never looked at the comments, but even there, it's entirely possible you didn't fully get why. The simple reason, and the only reason I feel really matters, is I'm just not comfortable writing a chucklefuck version of Angela's story arc, or even James's, really. Obviously, there were certain parts of the others I played straight, but I feel like for 2, I would have had to do too much of that to justify touching it in the first place. I sort of consider the Where Are They Now end credits of SH3 abridged to be the closest I'll ever get to doing 2. If someone else wants to try their hand at that one, I am not opposed whatsoever. Hell, toss me a link, I'll give it a watch. But the point is, Silent Hill 2's story is fucking poignant and layered and powerful as hell. This is a game that replays very well, because once you know why James is really there, it gives a new meaning to everything you see and experience. A flashlight attached to an old dress isn't just a flashlight attached to an old dress anymore. It's your wife casting an accusing light on you because she remembers what you did to her. Why does Maria come back after Pyramid Head kills her? Because seeing her die once isn't enough to stop James from running from his problems. In fact, one of my favorite endings in SH2, even though I know it's not one of the more popular ones generally, is the Maria ending. In most of the main endings, Maria turns into the final boss, since she's the last thing chaining James to his delusions. In the Maria ending, however, the final boss is a vindictive and cruel version of Mary, likely a projection of some persecution complex on James's part. In other words, whatever he says, he's still ultimately convinced that none of what happened is really his fault. At that point, in his eyes, she's just a specter that's keeping him from moving on. So his reward for killing his wife again is another incarnation of Maria, his idealized version of Mary, whom he can live happily ever after with. Until Mary's narrated letter from the other endings finishes playing over the scene, and Maria starts coughing. Monsters or no monsters, he can't escape from the truth. Maria will share the same fate that Mary did, the reset button will be pressed, and maybe James still won't learn a damn thing. And it'll just keep repeating until he does. The Maria ending's the first one I ever got, and it didn't fully register with me quite why it worked until I played a few more times and got other endings. One of the major things that annoyed me about Downpour, yes, I know, taking a big ol' shit on the Western games again, but I told you this might happen, and I'm using it to elaborate on a point here. It's how your choices over the course of the game actively change what you did in the past. You can create a truth in which you did absolutely nothing wrong, in which case it makes zero sense for you to be there experiencing wacky introspective Silent Hill shit. But Silent Hill 2 doesn't do that. You can change how you react to the past, but you can't change the past. Acting nice won't erase what you've done. James Sunderland murdered his wife, and he can choose to live with it, die with it, run from it, or try in vain to reverse it. Or, do some shit with a dog and a bunch of UFOs. So for as much praise as I heap on 1 and 2, they do admittedly have some quirks in the control sense that can be off-putting to some. I don't think it's unintentional, and the difficult controls do contribute to the horror and the feeling of helplessness, but sometimes you really just want to run around hitting nightmare abominations with a katana while, kinda getting reasonably spooked. I mean, I'd be lying if I said it didn't detract a bit from the horror. But yeah, this is where I think Silent Hill 3 has its own advantage. It's just fun to play, at least in my experience. I mean, the controls aren't perfect because it's still a survival horror game, but somehow it feels a little tighter and more responsive than its predecessors, and makes it feel a little more welcoming to play and replay. And speaking of replaying, let's talk New Game Plus weapons. I mentioned the katana earlier, and it isn't as though one doesn't exist in Silent Hill 1, but it's a New Game Plus weapon there. 3 gives you the option to pick it up during the course of your first playthrough, and Heather, from my experience, wields it a lot better than her dad does. So, if that's one of your regular weapons, what kinds of things does New Game Plus offer you? An infinite ammo SMG? A magical girl wand? A fucking lightsaber? Try all of the above. Now, Silent Hill 3 is a little light on its multiple ending count compared to 1 and 2, and yet somehow I have more playthroughs of this game than any other entry in the series. And I think the simple reason for that is just that it's so much fun to play through for me. I love seeing what I can do in different sections with different weapons, and the more comfortable I get with it, the more I can challenge myself with higher difficulty using shittier weapons. Also, I'm just gonna say it outright. Heather is the most badass protagonist in the Silent Hill franchise. Why do I say this? Well, Harry ends up in Silent Hill by chance and presses on because he has to find his daughter. James is led there by his guilt and self-persecution. Neither of them quite know what they're in for once they get there, and it's too late to turn back by then. But Heather? She got a taste of what the place had to offer, and no, it wasn't exactly her cup of tea. But once they killed her dad, the man who trudged through hell to protect her in a past life, she was out for blood, having absolute confidence that everything waiting for her in Silent Hill was way worse than anything she'd seen before. And this resolve is not necessarily presented as a good thing. Remember Vincent's rant towards the end about how bloodthirsty and awful Heather is? If you consider her characterization up to that point, he's not wrong. And while that's enforced by the story, it's also sort of enforced by the gameplay. The more power you get to effectively take down enemies, the more inclined you are to actually do so, which really helps to make the implications of what Vincent follows that rant up with all the more chilling. Because I can tell you, I did a lot more enemy dodging in 1 and 2 and spent a lot more time on actual combat in 3. So, yeah. Now that I've spoken at length about my 3 favorite games in the series and touched on my problems with some of the later ones, I do want to talk just a bit about one of the more contentious entries, Silent Hill 4: The Room. As I mentioned briefly before, SH4 was part of my introduction to Silent Hill. On a look back, yeah, it's got some serious problems. When I first watched and then played it though, I wasn't as affected by those problems as I was the atmosphere and enemy design. And yeah, the other games did it way better, but it was enough of a taste for me to get into the series. And for that, I can't completely hate it. Call it a lingering fondness for baby's first Silent Hill, if you will. I actually did play with the idea of abridging it, but it ended up basically being a reimagining of Tommy Wiseau's The Room with Walter as Johnny and Henry as Mark. And I realized that that concept really doesn't have enough steam to sustain itself. And like 8 million other people have already thought of it. Kind of feel awkward anytime I claim that Silent Hill is my favorite horror franchise, because there's only like 3 games out of 9 that I really like enough to want to claim that. But you know, the Mother series only had 3 games, and you'd better believe I'll eventually have an Opinionsplosion about that. I mean, if the outlook on this one is generally positive. So, if I pretend a bunch of the other games don't exist, the ratio's just fine, right? I guess what it comes down to is how much those 3 games resonated with me. The comparison I typically boil it down to is with Resident Evil, that being Capcom's most prolific horror franchise. And the answer I usually come to is that I would rather play the best Silent Hills than the best Resident Evils. But I would rather play the worst Resident Evils than the worst Silent Hills. And maybe that's due to an excessive amount of reverence for those original 3 games, but I think they set such a high standard for me that the substandard games we've gotten out of that franchise just sting that much more. Of course, your mileage may vary on that, but that's my Opinionsplosion and I stand by it. Okay, that's terrible. Well, if you have any thoughts or a catchphrase I can shamelessly plagiarize, leave them in the comments below. Good night, and go fuck yourselves, everyone.